Hello, listeners. Jeff Hutton here. I had hoped to run a pod this week about the fallout for Indonesia and Southeast Asia stemming from this U.S. presidential election. But since the results of that, including the scale of victory, may not be known for a few days, I thought we'd run a pod I recorded last week with our friend Erin Cook. She's the author of the Southeast Asia newsletter, Dari, Mulut. I know it seems a little weird talking about something other than U.S. presidential politics right now, but it's worth remembering that whomever moves into the White House will be dealing with the region reeling from its own crisis of democracy. Thailand's King Rama X is hell-bent on restoring the throne's powers. In Malaysia, the government is employing trick after parliamentary trick to retain power after seizing it from a duly elected government earlier this year. In the background, there's COVID-19, expansionist China filling in for what appears to be a receding United States. And as I listen back to this pod, I'm reminded just how endlessly fascinating this region is and how lucky Erin and I are to be reporters here. And if you've listened this far, maybe you feel the same way too about Southeast Asia and possibly will be eager for a reprieve from the political uncertainty radiating from the other side of the Pacific. We'll be back with U.S. election-related coverage next week, but for now, here's the endlessly enthusiastic, inspiring, and insightful Erin Cook, author of Dari Mulut. Erin Cook, it is great to see you again. How are you?
I'm not bad. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. You're in Canberra now?
Yes, and it's gone back to being freezing again, so I'm very jealous of you over there.
It's gone back to being freezing?
Yeah, it's supposed to be spring, and it was, I don't know, it was in the high 20s, not high 20s, mid-20s for a couple of days there, and straight back to winter. So that was a bit of a tease.
Well,
shocker.
On to hotter topics then. That might keep you warm.
Ooh, good segue.
Yeah,
yes.
How's that for a segue? Thailand. And I'm going to ask you right here on the pod to say the king's real full name.
No, I can't do it. I only ever get so far as Maha, and then I get a bit nervous.
Rajira Longkorn?
Yes. You're very good at this.
I practiced all afternoon at Starbucks.
I always go with the Rama 10. So he's the, plus, I don't know, most style guides have one or the other, so that seems to work all right.
Well, I think even that sort of, back in the days of his father, if we were to, you and I sit somewhere in Bangkok making light of the king's name.
I haven't been able to laugh about it.
We would be in a little bit of trouble if we went to publish that, right? And now there are thousands, tens of thousands of people on the street in Bangkok who would like nothing more and say so publicly in front of the palace to see his back, see him go. What has changed from that reluctance to criticize a king to want the guy out?
It is truly stunning to me. Like I can't say it enough, I think, and I think I do say it very, very frequently, but like to have gone from the mourning we saw for his father, and all the reporting around the time did say, his son isn't as close to as revered and well respected as the father was. But to see this level of outrage at, his spending, his time abroad, his disregard, or his perceived disregard for the Thai people, I thought this would take decades if it were to happen. Well, certainly a lot longer than 18 months, 2 years. It's unbelievable.
Yes, so that's right.
Yeah. I saw the photojournalism that's coming out of Bangkok in the last few weeks is just incredible. But I saw this great photo of just on one of the busy Bangkok streets, someone had painted the Thai flag and then wrote Republic of Thailand on it.
Whoa!
Motorbike taxi drivers were taking photos of each other. It was unbelievable. That's incredible. So I think that sort of thing's probably a bit far in the eyes of a lot of people, but that, as you said, as it's being openly discussed, that's a whole new world for Thailand.
Right. And is it all COVID is it, and the recession related to it, has he just been dealt a raw deal?
I think it's interesting. There's definitely an element of it, and maybe that's why it has kind of pushed it to a head much sooner than it was kind of predicted. I think Thailand's infamous for having one of the largest income inequality gaps in the world, and a lot of that is because of the extreme wealth of the monarchy, which is the wealthiest monarchy in the world. So these sorts of questions about income inequality and class have always been an issue, but with the intense stress of the COVID pandemic, it was a powder keg, really.
Right.
And then, not to mention, the king hasn't even been there for most of the time. He bases himself a lot of the time in a Bavarian chalet, or are they chalet in Germany? I don't know, but he's been holed up in hotels for months.
So where is he now? Just do you know?
Now he's back in Bangkok, which is where we saw the incredible footage last week, I think it was, of protesters on the street near the Royal Plaza. Police were trying to push them back so the motorcade could come through with the king and his wife. And protesters were raising the three-finger salute and shouting at the motorcade. So I think he's not too happy about being in Thailand, I'd imagine, because, it's getting a bit let them eat cake. But he's also having trouble with Germany, where he's based, who aren't too happy with him running another country from a hotel room. So
is he literally in a hotel? He's living in a hotel.
Yeah, there was a great story by one of the British publications kind of at the start of it all, back in like April or May. And he'd taken over an entire hotel because he's got, all of his people. There's dozens and dozens of people. And the report said something like the only other people at the hotel are staff, and he's effectively living there and running the country from there. And they'd just taken over the whole place, which is incredible.
So this sort of answers my next question, was that the perception of him was that he rather likes the money and none of the duties that came with it, or at least the perception of being there as sort of a national symbol and pillar of support. And then along comes COVID. And although it didn't hit Thailand quite as badly or nearly as badly as neighbors as Indonesia, heaven's sakes, it did absolutely gut the tourism industry, which makes up 30%.
A huge amount. Yeah, a surprising amount. Thailand was the first country outside of China to have a case, so it's been dealing with it for a long time. And I don't know, I find it like I was there for, what was it? Must have been the start of March. And even then, like it was still easy to fly from Jakarta to Bangkok to Chiang Mai, all that sort of thing. Tourism was still, operational. But even then, operators were saying it had really died off. So it's been such a long road for them, a bit longer than it has been for, Bali and these other hubs for tourism that have only really set in once it became such a global concern.
Now, are you on the phone with protesters there? What are they telling you if you are?
I've been speaking a lot actually with a friend of mine who's the photojournalist, and that's been really interesting because she gets out there and kind of checks it all out. And I think there's very much a view that there was a build up to this. So back in March and April, when there was the forced dissolution of the Future Forward Party and a few other political upsets, it seems like it was going to be a small build up to something much bigger further down the road. And it seems to have just accelerated so quickly. And it's now a big group of people. How do I say that? It's not a big group. It's a more diverse range of protesters than what we've traditionally, or not traditionally, can't say that about Thai protests, I guess, what we've seen in recent years when it's specifically post-2014.
Right.
So we see a lot of older people, which has been really cool, in addition to the students. And it's a bit of a confrontation with the loyalists who are predominantly, boomer and upwards. So there's a bit more of a cross-section with the pro-democracy side.
Yeah, Thailand, not the most stable political systems, they abandoned the absolute monarchy in the 1930s. There have been 12 coups since then. How many constitutions? 20 something?
I don't know. I really feel for Thai school children who have to
Right.
learn all of this by rote. It must be incredible.
In fact, I think that there is talk of another constitution now, or at least some sort of amendment to a constitution making its way
It's
through
certainly
Parliament.
one of the demands. I wouldn't be surprised if we see the constitution that was reformed in 2017 kind of thrown up for discussion. And I also wouldn't be surprised if we, by the end of it, see the leadership of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha challenged quite a bit. There was a really interesting op-ed today from The Nation, which has always been quite a traditionally supportive sort of publication, that was virtually calling for his head. So I think we'll see a bit more
change
exciting.
To come.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you were alluding to, it seems that we have these sort of these protests and this upset tumult every 5 to 6 years almost. And before Prime Minister Prayut, there were ongoing protests from the red shirts and the yellow shirts. And the yellow shirts are the royalists because that is the color of the monarchy, right? Yellow. And the red are the ones who want to, I suppose, they're not Republicans, they're reformists, but they tended to be more urban dwellers, and the yellow shirts were more were rural. Was that
it gets a bit complicated because the divide is also about where, like, geographic divide. So the red shirts were they come from supporting Thaksin Shinawatra, who was ousted in the 2006, 2008.
2006. God,
2006. Poor Thailand. Yeah. 2006. So they traditionally, even though he's one of the wealthiest people in Thailand, Thai people, I suppose it's not there at the moment. A lot of his support was rural poor from the north of Thailand, where his family originally came from. And then, progressive young urban, like, student sort of types. I would be really interested to learn a bit more about who makes up the loyalists at this point. There's been some great reporting from the Thai Inquirer, who is a must-read every day at this point, about the divisions that this is bringing into families in Thailand, where the children are a bit more pro-democracy while the parents are very, very staunch, and there's threats about, continuing to pay for education and supporting people during, like, trying to find jobs and stuff over the question of the monarchy and its role in the community. So it's
splitting families up or threatening.
It's splitting families up. Yeah, it reminds me a lot of those stories that we all read in, like, 2016, where you couldn't have Thanksgiving in the US anymore. But
that might still be the case for people. One last question on this, and we'll move on to Malaysia, where there's a marginally, seemingly better king.
Oh, God.
Hard to miss some parallels between what's happening in Bangkok and Hong Kong. What was happening in Hong Kong? Have you been giving any thought to that? I'm thinking of just the spontaneous protest and their singularity and the passion of wanting to reform a system that seems to me fairly repressive and anti-democratic. Democratic protest by young people. Are you thinking about that? Are there parallels, or how far should we expect that to run out, those parallels to run?
That's very interesting, because I think there's kind of two sides to that. I think on the one hand, you're absolutely right. Like, it's they're both protests that are very, very defined in what their goals are and what their aims are and who they are as a collective, which is a bit more defined than what we see in Manila and Jakarta, for example. And both Hong Kong and Bangkok have been pointing at each other to say, we're getting inspiration from this, or we're sending support and solidarity. And it's this milk tea alliance thing that's been getting a lot of traction, which is fascinating to read about, where it's tying
What's
together.
that? What's that? Milk Tea Alliance.
It ties together youth-led movements in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Thailand. And I think Thailand's side was originally specifically about Chinese influence in Thailand, but has since morphed into this very specific protest movement, which, while it doesn't have anything to do with China, is a lot more, at its bones, similar to these questions of, I suppose, identity and existentialism in these places.
Anti-authoritarian, right?
Absolutely. And, wanting more, democracy and a chance to have a say in its own future. And I think on the other side, there is a bit of an effort to force these sorts of both Hong Kong and Bangkok into the same easy box to say, look at the protests in Asia, look at the movement in Asia, when really the political terms, like the terminology is very much the same, but the aims are very, very different. And the history of where these movements have come from are very different. Hong Kong, of course, has a completely different history to Thailand and its movement. And, protesters in Thailand have been doing this for, as we were saying, for decades. There's been important protests in Bangkok this year have been revolved around commemorating important anniversaries of previous crackdowns that killed students. So it's very deeply tied to its own history. Whereas Hong Kong certainly is, but Hong Kong's history is just different.
What is the ultimate goal that you can discern, what you've been looking at? Do they want a republic or they just reform?
I think that by pushing so hard for reform to the monarchy, it is an example of pushing further than you think that you're going to get, so you end up better off than you would. I think that there's an acceptance that things need to change, but they can't change that much within, a year. But I do think that some of the questions around the leadership of General Prayut and his government, as well as that 2017 constitution, I think those may be more willing to go to the mat for.
Deeply, deeply unpopular. Speaking of deeply, deeply unpopular, Prime Minister Muhyiddin Yassin, he is hanging on by a thread, and he's been thrown a life jacket from the king, from whom he was seeking emergency powers to declare martial law, effectively, ostensibly because of a spike in COVID-19 infections. The king said no, and then told everyone to stop bickering and had his full confidence. It seems to me like the prime minister there in Malaysia just got some extra time to sort his crap out. Well, we can say shit. It's my podcast. To get his ducks in a row. Is that has he just had borrowed time then?
I think that's pretty bang on. I think this is going to make a fantastic Netflix series one day. The whole thing has just been incredible.
House of Cards, definitely.
It'd be like, I know House of Cards was hard to believe at the best of times anyway, but this is just so melodramatic. It'd be even hard. Because it's been, poor Malaysia has been trying to do, like the spike in COVID cases is real. It's very, very serious. The new research from published in Malaysia Kini today by a group of epidemiologists and public health experts at a whole bunch of different universities in Malaysia, that suggested on current modelling that by November 8, we'd be looking at 15,000 active cases in Malaysia, which is far more than we had when Malaysia locked down the first time, when everybody had the first go around. So that is serious. But as you said, it's very hard to believe that that's what motivated the call for a state of emergency. That's been kind of very widely seen as just an effort to kind of quieten down debate over whether he should remain leader and whether his kind of cobbled together government should remain in power. And also a bit of a theory that next week he'll need to table and start debating the budget, and it's pretty much expected that the economy is like everyone, doing very, very poorly, and he doesn't want to have to weather all that sort of thing.
You promised in one of your missives there in Dari Mulut that you might offer a schematic rather than a textual explanation by way of text, and maybe a flow chart might be more apt.
I think we'll need it soon.
Can you run me through, in broad brushstrokes, the evolution from Mahati in 2018 to where we are now, and the likelihood or not of Anwar finally getting his prize?
Yes, Anwar's the big question, isn't he? Well, now, so famously, Mahathir came back to power with the Pakistan Harapan government. That seemed to be doing okay, but the question of Anwar and Anwar's leadership loomed heavily. And that came to a head in March in the most confusing way possible that I still don't understand at all. But that's where it was kind of seen that Anwar may have been seizing power but was not able to, which is how Muhyiddin came to power with the Perikatan Nasional, which is his coalition that looks very, very similar to the previous UMNO governments, such as that led by Najib Razak and also by Mahathir. So it's never been stable. It never had a vote of confidence by people who just said, why don't we just have an election? Why don't we just go to vote again? Which seems a very reasonable demand if you're going to seize power effectively like that.
So he basically cobbled together a minority coalition.
Yes.
After pushing Mahathir.
Which, after pushing him out, which then got a lot of the former government, then opposition, back into the government. So a lot of Najib Razak's guys, for instance, are now back in. So since then, since March, there's just been this question lingering, sometimes at the forefront and sometimes behind the COVID pandemic, of what's actually going to happen here. And I think we're seeing it come to a head now. And it feels very complicated, and also like it's taking a long time. The king has tried to intervene a few times to say, as you said, stop bickering. He's not interested in talking to Anwar just yet until he can really show all of his cards, after he claimed that he had enough people to hold government, which never came to fruition. So I'm not sure where we're at there. So really, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up with a dissolution of government in the next couple of months. It just seems like a bizarre little stalemate that we can't move out of at the moment. And then, of course, there's the extremely huge outbreak of the pandemic again. So,
that
whole thing.
Oh, right. People's lives and livelihoods at risk. But there's power to squabble over. The big question in all this is, does Anwar, poor Anwar, have
always the bridesmaid?
Yeah, have a shot at the brass rings? He's a little bit like Charlie Brown to
he is,
whoever Lucy would be. In the football.
Oh. For a while there, he seemed very, very confident. I thought he had it. The king, so this was a couple of weeks ago, and the king was in hospital for a week. So he came out and said, I've got a healthy majority. And then he kind of took it to the king, and the king said, no, I'm not that interested in this. It doesn't seem like you've actually got it. So get out of here. In between all of this happening, there was a by-election in Sabah, which is one of the eastern states of Malaysia, which is it was always going to be a tight one, but it ended up not being as tight as it was expected, and Muhyiddin's government allies picked up a lot of spots. So that was kind of a hit for Anwar, a bit of a hit to the confidence in the fact that, so many MPs were allegedly jumping over to his side. I'm not too sure. I don't know. I'm Australian. We've seen this 100 times. Just got to have an election.
Yeah, it is a little bit Game of Thronesy and squabbling over in King's Landing.
It is.
We've got protests in Bangkok. We've had protests in Jakarta. There must be simmering discontent in Malaysia. You alluded to unrest in the Philippines and a milk tea alliance. The preconditions of some political change, possibility of
I think it's a very incredible
Arab Spring.
time.
Yeah,
it does have because it is similar, I suppose. This is going to come back to bite me. It is similar in that Arab Spring sort of way where it ignited across a region, but it was very specific,
right.
Tailored to each country, and I think that's what we're seeing, which is very, very interesting. What Thailand's fighting for is very specific to Thailand. What Indonesia's fighting for with the omnibus law is very specific to Indonesia's economic circumstance. And what we're seeing in Philippines on a much smaller scale than anywhere at the moment, just because of the lockdown that's until very recently still in place there. Even that was very, all revolved around Duterte and law and order sort of questions. So I don't know. I think it's a very, very interesting time.
We can, at the very least, expect more lockdowns.
That's it. If there's one constant, it's the pandemic. So,
how is the newsletter coming along?
Not
working
bad.
From Canberra.
It's not. I don't know. It's hard to not be in it. Not be able to meet friends for a coffee or at the bar and get a good view of what's actually happening all across the place. Like, if this pandemic wasn't here, I would be in Bangkok straight away. What an incredible time to be there.
Right.
But yeah, so it's hard to run this sort of thing and get a real feel for what's actually going on from all the way down here in quiet old Canberra. So
yeah, it seems it's almost as if it's something you see through a Zoom chat, much like we're doing.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Well, it's kind of surreal watching like the omnibus law protests on TikTok. I was like, this is just around the corner from my flat, but I'm watching it on TikTok.
Well, hang in there, Erin. I really enjoyed speaking with you, and I love the product. You're doing great work.
Oh, thank you.
Keep it up.
Well, I'll be sure that all the readers get to learn all about the podcast as soon as this one goes up.
Smash that subscribe button, everyone. Say it with me, Erin. Smash that subscribe button.
Subscribe to Jeff.
Subscribe to Dari Mulut. Sweetie, thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye, doll.
Sorry. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. And that's the pod. Thanks to Erin Cook, author of newsletter Dari Mulut. Our producer is Stephen Handoko, research by Imam Shofwan, music by Soundstripe. And if you like us, please rate us and subscribe. It means so much to us when you do. As always, you can contact us on Instagram at @onthelevel_podcast. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.